Once again, we welcome you to Moving Forward with Young Voices. Happy to welcome Alex Rosado back to the program. Alex, you've been on here a few times, but I always like to assume there is someone who is meeting you for the very first time. Take a moment, if you would, and tell us just a little bit about who you are.
Well, I always appreciate you having me on. Thank you so much for the opportunity. I'm Alex. I work as a professional programs assistant at the Alexander Hamilton Society, which is a nonpartisan nonprofit, so everything I say is not reciprocal of the organization's views.
Very good. Well, I'm looking at an article that you had published on Real Clear Politics, and I got to admit, this one grabbed my attention. The title is Deja Flu, How to Avoid Another Lockdown. Now, Alex, I like to believe that we're well past the lockdowns and there's no way it could happen again, but in my heart, I know that the possibility is still there. Talk to me a little bit about some of the things that you see that would prompt this warning about, hey, we need to be careful lest we find ourselves being moved toward another lockdown.
Well, it may seem like a little bit of a bad reprise of 2020 when it comes to the handling of some public health crises that may emerge. You have stuff like the bird flu that's going around, and it's hitting multiple states at once. Indiana, most prominently, is really being affected. There's mass culling of their poultry, and it's spreading to zoos, other wildlife, and daily products that we purchase, such as eggs. The prices have skyrocketed. So really, it's looking at the federal government to have a response that, one, can tame this, and also, two, that people can trust. Unfortunately, a lot of Americans have lost faith within health institutions, and you saw that especially during the COVID pandemic because they relied on lockdowns. And if the government is smart, we won't go back to that lockdown mentality, and Americans must reject that if something terrible were to occur again.
Now, you point out at the very beginning of your article that one of the very first things that President Trump did upon taking office was he withdrew America from the World Health Organization. And what were some of the reasons why he said that he did that?
Well, one of which was the funding from the World Health Organization wasn't exactly on par with what America needed to sustain its quality of life. That's part of the reasons why the lockdowns were enacted in the first place, was because there wasn't an adequate flow of resources that could mitigate the COVID pandemic. And they figured the most beneficial part of having people stay at home is stopping and slowing the spread. We know that isn't true because there have been multiple studies that have come out, even by the National Institute of Health, that have said that the lockdowns at the state level, at the federal level, didn't slow the spread. Actually, it sometimes in some cases ramped it up. And you saw the detrimental effects that it came with the economy. $14 trillion worth. Just gone. That came out of taxpayers' wallets. That's twice the impact of the Great Recession. You saw that with education. You saw schools, K through 12, shut down across America. Most of America, that is. Some states decided to be free, which was good. But a lot of that came to children's education deficits that educational experts say that there's a learning loss that will never be recovered. So for all those reasons and more, it was smart for him to pull out of the World Health Organization.
As you list those off, I realize how much I must be repressing a lot of memories because it's like, oh yeah, that's right. They did that. The one that still sticks with me is that we actually divided society up into essential versus non-essential. And it was interesting that, the managerial class or the expert class, well, of course, we're essential. And the people who deliver our Uber Eats and whatever, they're considered essential. But everybody else was kind of put on a back burner. And as you have outlined here, it had disastrous consequences. What makes them think that they could do it again? I know you mentioned there's at least one FDA official that warns, well, they might try it again.
Well, simple enough. As you made those delineations before, it's essential versus non-essential. Well, every American is essential. We all have a vital role to play within our ecosystem, especially in our local communities. And that's why it would be best apt for state and local governments to champion a pro-liberty response to any public health crisis and pandemic. And there's a couple reasons for that. It's one, just the psychological benefits of autonomy. You make people have their own decision-making processes, so that way there's not a one-stop approach to everything, as you saw with the lockdowns, and you saw the mass rebellions that came with it too, especially in May of 2020 when all of this was starting to really get under people's skin. You also have tailored decision-making. Would you rather trust the federal government to have a policy that isn't exactly what your family, your neighbors, your community needs, or would you rather trust local institutions that have more of a pulse and understand the needs of the community. There's also community engagement and trust as well. If you have people making their own decisions, they are able to trust the institutions in charge because it comes down to a matter of respect. Lockdowns were not respectable by any means, and people took the measures, even against the federal government's suggestions, to do what they had to do.
No, I think that's a very good breakdown. One of the things you mentioned here that just stood out to me is that states need to inform the entire population of a sickness's risks, not to fearmonger us, but to empower us so that we can make the best decision for our situation. And that's the point I think they missed the first time around. The reason that those lockdowns were so disastrous was, yes, there were risks, but choice was not allowed to exist alongside those risks. And if there's risk, there has to be choice.
Certainly. And you saw the lack of choice spell out into the areas, as mentioned beforehand, with the economy and education. And you saw that especially among parents who have young kids that were in kindergarten and other forms of early childhood education. They don't want to enroll their kids in public education anymore. They're feeling the burn of this, even 4 years later. You're seeing that higher rates of remote instruction, which were touted as an innovation and solution to the education crisis that came alongside COVID. A lot of kids have developed anxiety over it. A lot of kids have developed eye strain from looking at the computer screens all days. It is not the same as being in an in-person environment. You need a community. You need support. And locking people down and isolating themselves from the world around them certainly doesn't foster that. It takes collaboration, it takes respect, and that's something that transcends government policy.
Yeah, I mean, you've said it beautifully. In fact, I think it was just yesterday I was looking at an article about California and some of the woes that their schools are facing. 360,000 students have left their school system. And you want to care to guess where it began? During the lockdowns.
No, and that is a trend that you're seeing. But the question also that comes with it is, where are these people going? You're looking at free states like Florida because they championed a pro-liberty response that people respected and is measurably even better than keeping people locked down. Well, I'll tell you some statistics with this. You saw that Florida had low school-related COVID-19 cases, and they kept the economy open, they kept education open. Less than 1% of registered students had COVID during the entirety of the COVID pandemic. You also saw mass migration rates, about 24% of people coming from blue states like California, New York, because people want to resume daily operations. And you even saw, too, that with Florida's approach, they had developed remote learning beforehand, so that way in the face of a crisis, you had flexibility, you had options, you had customs. So they were easily able to open everything back up come within September 2020. And by that point, about 45% of registered students were receiving full-time in-person instruction. And that's the way you got to do it if there's another pandemic.
So I have to ask, who is this going to be a hard sell for? I mean, I'm on board. You don't have to try to win me over. I'm there. But who are the people who would resist the idea of we need to keep that autonomy and that ability to choose what is in our best interest?
To the unelected bureaucrats, of course. But I think this is a message that everybody can resonate with. If you believe in the power of family, if you believe in the power of the economy, if you believe in the power of education, you're willing to fight for it to be free and open for all. And I truly do think that that is the mentality that Americans need to have when it comes to public health, and is why we must reject the lockdown mentality.
Beautiful. Again, we're talking with Alex Rosado. He is a professional programs assistant at the Alexander Hamilton Society, as well as a contributor for Young Voices. Alex, for those who want to follow you and your work, what's the best way to go about that?
You can follow me on X at Alex P. Rosado.
Very good. Great to catch up with you once again, and I thank you for your time.
Thank you. You as well.
Welcome back. This is our second segment in Moving Forward with Young Voices today. Happy to welcome a new Young Voices contributor. Her name is LyLena Estabine. And LyLena, very good to have you on the program. Welcome.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
So people are meeting you for the very first time. I'd like to take just a moment here at the beginning of our segment and have you just tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do.
Sure thing. I am a policy researcher at the Illinois Policy Institute. So I look into policies to help improve life for Illinoisans and Chicagoans, particularly looking at housing policy and poverty alleviation.
So is it safe to say that Chicago, like other major cities across the U.S., is feeling a bit of a housing crisis at this time?
Yes, I would definitely say that's fair to say. About 1 in 3 people in Chicago are housing burdened, which means that they pay at least 30% of their income on housing, whether that's their mortgage or their rent.
And let's talk about who is affected most by this. Talk to me about the disadvantaged or those who are maybe wanting to become first-time, home buyers. How does this affect them?
Absolutely. So in Chicago, it's no mystery that disparities continue to exist. It's been rated as one of the most, if not the most, segregated city in America. And what that means is that opportunities are also kind of on this disparity as well. So what we see is that if you look at a map of Chicago, where there's the most housing burden is on the south and west sides of Chicago in predominantly Black communities.
Okay. So what is the city doing about that? Or are they doing anything at this point?
Yes, there's been talk and they're trying to. I think across the nation, more and more cities are realizing that housing affordability is primarily, first and foremost, an issue of housing supply. And what that means is decreasing regulations that limit the construction and development of housing. And also looking for new opportunities to increase housing supply, sometimes in ways that have been overlooked or pushed to the side. So one of the ways that the city is doing that is through additional dwelling units. Sometimes they're called accessory dwelling units or auxiliary dwelling units. Pretty universally, they're known as ADUs. And these are units of housing that are added to an existing home, either on the side or attached to the house. You might have heard them called coach houses, granny flats. But this is a way to increase density in a light touch manner, which means that instead of finding ways to pack in housing in a high rise in an area that's previously only been single family homes, we can build smaller homes and not change the character of the neighborhood too drastically while still allowing for a naturally affordable solution.
I have to congratulate you because my lexicon expanded a little bit today. I hadn't heard of coach houses before. In fact, we do have a thing we call mother-in-law apartments, which I think kind of serves the same purpose. This is one that I would like you to elaborate on just for a moment. English basements. That's a term I've not heard before.
Yeah. Yep. Before I had started getting into this research, I hadn't heard of it either. But yeah, these are all terms that are used to describe this same phenomenon, which is adding a unit of housing inside or outside of the house. And
it's the regulatory environment that prevents people from doing this currently, correct?
Right, exactly. In a city like Los Angeles, which has very notably expanded their access to additional dwelling units in an effort to help with their affordability challenges. In 2022, they had a little over 7,000 permits for additional dwelling units. The city of Chicago in that same year had 109. And that's insane. But when you look at the regulations, it becomes a little bit more understandable. So when we looked at the pilot areas for Chicago currently allows this type of development in a few select areas. One thing that we noticed was that in addition to just the low numbers, there was also a difference in where these units were being developed. Primarily, there was a distinct difference between the north and northwest pilot areas and the southwest and southeast pilot areas. While about 60% of homes eligible for ADU development are in the south and west sides of Chicago, only 6.5% of permits given out are in those areas. And so looking into this, I was like, what is causing this disparity? And the ordinance actually creates more regulations for people living in the South and West Sides, Chicago's predominantly Black communities, where this type of housing and development is needed most. So one example is that if you want to build an ADU on the South or West Side, the building has to be owner occupied. And that's a regulation that doesn't apply to people on the North and Northwest sides. And actually, if we look at pre-approval data, over 60% of the pre-approvals on the North and Northwest side are not owner occupied. So that gives you an idea of how much of a limitation this might be causing. Another pretty arbitrary restriction is that only 2 units per block per year can be permitted on the Southwest and Southeast sides, and no such restriction like that exists on the North and Northwest sides. One of the restrictions I found the most surprising was that the ordinance says that vacant lots cannot have an ADU developed on them before a primary residence. So in the north side, if you have a vacant lot, you can build a tiny home before you build the primary home, but that's not going to fly anywhere else in the city. Well, if you've ever been to Chicago, then you know most of the vacant lots in Chicago, about 80% of them, exist in predominantly Black communities on the city's south and west side. So once again, a huge opportunity for development, for growth, that's completely being limited by the city. And when we think about the impact this can have, we talked about how housing affordability is a challenge. It's especially for homeowners that have managed to buy a home. If we think about wanting to increase home equity, particularly in Black communities for Black families, an ADU is a great way to do that. Not only are you able to potentially get a second stream of income from rent, but you're also increasing the value of your home. In Chicago, homes with an ADU are valued at about 64% higher than homes without one. But because of the limitations placed here, this opportunity for development and for building wealth has been pretty much stifled in the south and southwest parts of the city.
I don't want to oversimplify this, but please correct me if I'm wrong here. It really sounds like the parts of the city where it's easiest to add an ADU are probably the parts where those who live there would find it easier to grease the right palms. In other words, they may have more income with which they can purchase the necessary permissions, whereas in lower income areas, that's not as easily done. Is that a bad way to characterize it, or does that come close to the target?
I think that comes pretty close to it. Yeah.
So what is being done, at least on the ground in Chicago? Surely someone has seen this recommendation that you're advocating for in this article. Is there movement on this? Is there resistance to it?
There is a little bit of movement on it. We are seeing some aldermen in the city council wanting to expand this ordinance, which is really what needs to happen. Right now, the ordinance is very limited with these pilot areas, and then, of course, the additional restrictions I mentioned before, depending on what neighborhood you live in. Really, what needs to happen is the city just needs to get out of its own way. The pilot areas need to be absolved, and just ADUs need to be allowed by right throughout the city of Chicago, regardless of where you live, regardless of whether it's owner-occupied or not. The resistance that we might see is because Chicago's aldermen have a lot of control over their neighborhoods, what gets built and what doesn't get built. And so there might be some hesitance to allow for people to have this kind of power in development. But if the city wants to see a change in terms of housing affordability and an increase in equity, they have to allow people the power to solve this issue. And that's what ADUs can do.
I can see this being kind of a hard sell for politicians because once they have power, it's really hard to give it up. But I think you're absolutely on target with your recommendation of, government needs to get out of its own way in order to allow this to become a solution. Again, we're talking with LyLena Estabine. She is a policy researcher at the Illinois Policy Institute. LyLena, where can people follow you, either on social media or where can they follow your writing?
Yes, you can see more of my writing on this subject and others at illinoispolicy.org. You can also find me on X at LyLena Estabine.
Thank you so much for your time. I look forward to our next conversation.
Thanks. I do as well.
And we are back. Happy to welcome Sam Raus back to the program. He is a recent graduate of the University of Miami. He's the Tech and Consumer Freedom Fellow with Young Voices. And Sam, I'm probably missing a few of the hats that you wear. Anything else you want to tell us about yourself?
No, it's really the main focus has been writing about artificial intelligence, antitrust, different financial and economic issues that are impacting the United States with Young Voices.
Well, we've got another issue here that is affecting a lot of people, and that is student loan debt. And I'm looking at a piece that was published in USA Today that you authored. Will Trump fix the student loan crisis? Conservatives should address the mounting debt. First of all, let's put this into context as far as I've heard off and on over the years about the student loan crisis. When we talk about that, what exactly are we describing?
Yeah, so over the past 4 years, the Biden administration tried pretty rigorously to implement a complete forgiveness of student loans, essentially interjecting the federal government to pay off the debt that students take on, both from public and private loans, to go to college. And this comes from our rather complex student loan system where you can take up to a certain amount of public loans. Most people choose to do so as they have much lower interest rates controlled by Congress, and then go on to take the remainder of your cost of college, as most colleges cost way more than that in private debt. This has really bubbled in the past decade or two into what is trillions of dollars in debt being held by American consumers among people of, a highly educated class, obviously college attendees that generally work in a lot of professional sectors and some of the highest income and highest cost of living areas in the United States. And it's bubbled into now a crisis, quite honestly. And I think it's hard for everyone to swallow that, of personal finance. I mean, people owe a very large portion, if not an entire paycheck's worth a month, towards debt that they owe for their education to get the job in the first place. And it just trickles over to so many different things. What people are spending their money on then impacts their choices in housing, their ability to afford groceries, which trickles over into the GDP of the economy more broadly. And what's unfortunate is that for the past several years, the Biden administration did not take a serious approach in addressing this problem from the angle of personal finance, but rather tried to just make the problem disappear.
Wow. Now, I remember hearing about the student loan crisis probably 10 years ago or more. And at that time, one of the things that really struck me was I was told student loan debt is one of those weird types of debt that cannot be forgiven. Kind of like, if you're convicted of robbing a bank, you're not forgiven of the debt of repaying the money that you took. And I thought, well, that's really curious. But the Biden administration really did a lot to propose to cancel those debts. I don't know if if canceling is the same thing as forgiving. What about those student loan borrowers who were counting on those debts being canceled or forgiven? Where do they sit right now? Last I heard, the Supreme Court had said that they couldn't do that, but then I heard that the Biden administration actually went ahead and did it to some degree. Where do those people sit?
Yeah, it's a bit of a confusing case because some of the actions that the administration took were targeted specifically at people that had fallen into predatory loan schemes, students that had gone to for-profit colleges, which we know are generally pretty predatory. And I believe that some of those stood or were addressed through other budgetary processes. But I think more generally, the average voter assumed when the Biden campaign campaigned on student debt cancellation, forgiveness, whatever you want to call it, that something was going to happen, that they would see that number on their thing, even if the actual platform didn't include, whatever income bracket they're from or what kind of college they attended. And now the Democrats completely lost control, and that seems like a far pipe dream that the Supreme Court completely shut down. And we know the Supreme Court will remain a conservative majority for probably most of our lifetimes. So it seems rather impossible for that to ever occur. And these voters are wondering what comes next. What kind of policies will be implemented ultimately then?
Now, you point out in your article, though, that there is some action taking place at the state level. For instance, talk to me about what's going on in Pennsylvania.
Yeah, so Pennsylvania Governor Josh Shapiro introduced in his latest budget this past year a tax deduction for essentially similar to how we have a mortgage interest tax deduction. We have other tax deductions for payments that individuals are making on certain areas of their life, up to, I believe, $2,500 a year could be deducted for loan repayments, which we all know is a rather low number, but it's an interesting way to start to look at this through more of the tax and cash flow lens rather than big sweeping federal mandates and expecting, the federal budget to step into these situations, but rather to take steps to make sure that individuals are able on a month by month basis to make these payments without it impacting, their cost of living and other formats of life, and they're able to spend more money ultimately towards the economy, which will help them, get better interest rates, be able to make more money and pay it off quicker. And I think this is a thing that really the new administration needs to take up and the new Congress needs to take up, considering the fact that cancellation is never going to happen. And yet this problem remains. And certainly there's going to be a lot done on the front of the underlying costs and the underlying education situation, but you still have tens of millions of voters of my generation, that a lot of people that swung more towards the right that are now wondering what's going to happen as they get their financial footing as a young person set up.
So for the people who are sitting back going, well, when they signed the papers, they knew what they were getting into, or they should have known, and therefore it's their problem, not mine. You point out in your article that the impact here extends beyond just the person who signed up for those student loans. Help me understand how that works.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think another thing that's important for people probably of an older generation, of people more on the right to recognize, is that yes, we always want to hold adults accountable for their own decisions, but generally these people were 17, 18 years old, the social pressure, the way, and pretty much there's very little options in terms of college. I mean, it's a slight difference between a public and private school at this point. But yeah, when we think about it more broadly, the financial situation of the general people, this impacts family formation. This impacts their ability to support older relatives with retirement. This impacts how much they are spending on the economy, which is how we raise revenue through sales tax. And so it has really trickle-on effects, and we need to think about it more holistically in terms of people's everyday financial well-being. And we all benefit from people being more financially prosperous and responsible, and that allows us to prevent much grander budgetary problems ultimately.
Okay, and that was the next question I wanted to ask you, is moving forward to prevent digging ourselves in deeper, what are some of the reforms that need to take place to keep the student loan, the student loan debt from ballooning?
Yeah, I think there's going to be a lot of questions with regard to reform to the Department of Education and what the FAFSA program will look like going forward, as well as different shakeups in the financial sector. But I certainly think that there's going to be a bigger cultural shift towards debt and cost of living in general being really a centerpiece of our policy, and looking at those different aspects of the everyday person's budget and how policy really can focus down on those things than maybe some of these more abstract things that come up in policymakers' minds.
You point out, too, that there needs to be action at the state level. Are there any states that are following, Pennsylvania's example?
I think there are a number that had already implemented it originally. I think it tends to be some of the more blue strongholds, but I certainly think there'll be diverse considerations in different states. I think, fortunately, a lot of red states like Florida benefit by their public system being so much more affordable than the private colleges that they may look at this a little bit differently, but there's certainly a room for the states and the state legislators to take action without waiting for Congress's hamstringed mess to get it done.
Again, we are talking with Sam Raus, a recent graduate of University of Miami and a Tech and Consumer Freedom Fellow with Young Voices. Sam, for people who want to follow you and follow your work, where's the best place to find you?
Yeah, you can find me on X at SamRouse1 and on the Young Voices platforms.
Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much for having me today.
And we are back. Happy to welcome Ed Tarnowski back to the program. Ed, we've had you on here before on Moving Forward with Young Voices, but for those who are meeting you for the very first time, take a moment, tell us about who you are and what you do.
Absolutely, yeah. Thanks for having me back on. My name is Ed Tarnowski. I am a policy and advocacy director at Ed Choice, where my work is focused on national policy for school choice and then advocacy in Northeast and Mid-Atlantic regions. I also host the State Choice podcast. Additionally, I am a contributor for Young Voices, where I talk about a varying number of issues, not just school choice. And just full disclosure, my opinions are totally my own.
Okay. Yeah, we'll make a note of that. Legal department, Ed's off the hook here for anything.
That's right.
Actually, I'm really grateful to have you on board today. We're not going to be talking about school choice as much here, but TikTok. Someone actually asked me about this yesterday, and I went, oh yeah, now I'm remembering there was a ban that was supposed to take place, and then
right.
TikTok still appears to be working. I'm still getting notifications on my phone. What is the situation with TikTok? And as your headline says, a TikToking time bomb for the rule of law. It sounds like a deadline has come and gone, and this is a rather important one.
That's absolutely right. So the way that the law was written was TikTok had until January 19th of this year to come up with either a plan, to prove significant progress toward divesting from ByteDance, from the Chinese company, or have done so already. If they had already divested by January 19th, it was all good. They could have continued to operate as normal under that new company, or if they could have provided evidence of significant progress toward making a divestiture, the president, prior to January 19th, could have extended that deadline by 90 days one time. However, once that January 19th deadline hit, that ability to extend that deadline was no longer in law. Biden decided he would not enforce the law. On January 19th, they announced they wouldn't enforce the law on the last day of his presidency, which was just making things up. That's not the law. And then when the new administration came into office, Trump issued an executive order issuing his DOJ to enforce it for 70 days, which also isn't a provision in the law, if that makes sense.
So, in other words, TikTok gets to operate as normal for that 75 days of not enforcing the ban, but so that's going to run out here at some point. What then?
Well, the thing that's interesting is, so one, based on the law, they trying to grant an extension ended January 19th. So it's what's going on with both what Biden and Trump are doing probably is contrary to the law, based on what's in congressional law and reaffirmed by the Supreme Court unanimously. So there is this extension of, I believe it's 75 days, but it's really questionable whether that's legal. And it's been really interesting to see what's happened because Tom Cotton and Speaker Johnson both made clear on January 19th that time for an extension was over on the 19th. And they kind of, and Tom Cotton particularly pointed out that there are steep fines for not following the law for these companies, some ranging in over $800 billion, almost $1 trillion. So you saw that it seems that the companies behind the operation of TikTok do feel enough confidence from Trump's executive order. What we have seen is Apple and Google do not. They are not currently. TikTok is still not listed on the App Store or on Google Play stores because presumably because they are aware of this potential for fines. So we're seeing kind of a mixed reaction from companies, if that makes sense.
Okay. Yeah. So that's interesting. I guess the fact that I had it downloaded beforehand, that's why it's still there. But
right.
On my iPhone, it does this mean that after the 75 days, could Apple could they stop the app from working, or is that something that is that a government matter?
It's a different company that's kind of behind the operation, and of course, ByteDance and TikTok can also choose whether or not to operate on their own. And because the law bans it from existing on U.S. app stores, but also bans it from operating within the U.S. Until a divestiture happens. So right now, the law says it's not supposed to be operating until a divestiture happens. Again, like that executive order has left had mixed reaction from companies in charge of both of these things. So theoretically, let's say that the executive order isn't challenged, then at the end of that deadline, the ban should be coming back into place, even though it should already be in place now. The negotiations should really be happening with the ban in place.
All right. So from the standpoint of ByteDance company, what happens if they follow through and start this divestiture? If they allow other companies to become either part owners or partners with them, what's the downside for them? I'm not in their shoes, and if it's our favorite spy tool, okay, I understand. But why would they resist, this push for divestiture?
Oh, this is a great question, and we actually have a real life example of something like this happening. I believe it was in 2015, around 2015 or 2016, when Grindr actually used the gay dating app, was actually once owned by a Chinese company. The U.S. Passed a very similar law saying you have to force sell or you'll be banned in the United States. They sold pretty quickly because the U.S. market has such a profit opportunity for companies that they said, well, of course, we don't want to. The company didn't want to lose out on those profits. It made more sense to sell and to take the money that comes with the deal of selling instead of losing out on the U.S. market and continuing. We're not seeing ByteDance react that way as a normal company generally would, because there's such a market that would to be lost out on that it would make more financial sense to sell, take the deal, sell, take that the money made from that deal, and then TikTok, move over. It'll operate in the United States under a different company. We haven't seen that, and to me, that's interesting, and I think that's something we should really pay attention to, because why aren't they acting like a normal company? Why have they made this decision to dig their heels in when they have such a risk of losing the U.S. market, which just has such a massive profit opportunity? So it seems that they're acting out of step as what a normal company usually would. To me, that may suggest that some of the claims of the more nefarious reasons for wanting for the way that ByteDance operates, whether that be trying to capture user data or mess with the algorithm, manipulate the algorithm on certain issues, may be real.
So I want some perspective too in terms of just how broad their reach is. Do we know how many users currently are signed up or have downloaded the TikTok app in America, for instance?
I don't remember the number right off the top of my head. I believe don't quote me on this, I think it's close to 120 million in the US, something around that. Don't quote me on that number, but it's a massive number.
Yeah, it's not a fledgling little startup, and they only have a small customer base. Right. I guess my reason for asking that is that's a very successful platform just by sheer numbers of participation. Is there a possibility that the U.S. government would be looking at stepping up and wanting to? I don't like when the state owns things, but right. Maybe the U.S. government has some designs. We'll buy into it.
Well, I certainly don't want it to go from one, and technically not government, but essentially one government to the other, because China really has control over what they do. And the law is clear too. There has to be 100% divestiture. I know a deal's been kind of floated to say, half and half ownership, but again, that's out of step with the law. The law says it has to be completely divested. So if a deal like that were to be struck, Trump would need to go back to Congress. Congress would have to change that law. Right now, the law says for TikTok to continue operating in the U.S., there needs to be a complete divestiture. And I certainly don't want to see U.S. government ownership either. I just hope it's in the hands of a Western company that isn't our number one adversary. We certainly wouldn't let the Soviet Union control CBS during the Cold War. And TikTok, as several polls show, is the number one news source for the younger generation.
But in the meantime, you've got an outgoing president and an incoming administration that seem to have kind of a casual relationship with the rule of law. That is problematic. We're talking with Ed Tarnowski. He's a writer for Young Voices. Ed, where can people follow you and your work?
Absolutely. So feel free to follow me on Twitter at Ed Tarnowski. For any of my work over at Ed Choice, go check me out at edchoice.org. Thanks for having me on, Bryan. It's always a pleasure.
Thank you.